Oh, hi. Good afternoon. Sorry for the delay here. My name is Paulo Sotero. I am the director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center, but I am here actually on behalf of my dear colleague and friend, Jeff DeBelco, the director of the Environmental Change and Security Program, for one more series in a series of discussions that we have been doing in cooperation and under the guidance of our guru, Tom Lovejoy, who is not only a great friend of the Wilson Center, of the Environmental Change and Security Program, but is actually a member of the Brazil Institute Advisory Council. We are here today to hear from two experts on the issue of lost cultures, what lost cultures can contribute to management of our planet. And they are, and you probably know them, Susan Crate is an interdisciplinary scholar specializing in environmental and cognitive anthropology. Her bio is available, and I will not read all of it. She is now an assistant professor of anthropology in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University, where Tom is also a professor. We have with us Wade Davis, the explorer in residence for the National Geographic, knows about, he already forgot about my country more than I will ever learn in that area of forests, peoples from the forests, etc. Wade has a very dense and long bio. You can also read a summary of it here in the speaker's bio that is available up front. He was named by the National Geographic Society as one of the explorers for the millennium. He is an ethnographer, a writer, photographer, and a filmmaker. And I will limit the reading of their biographies at this, and I would like to invite, I believe that Susan will go first, and after Susan makes her presentation, she will make a presentation on, actually the two ecosystems we're going to talk about could not be more different. The Siberia on the one hand, and the Amazon on the other. So what's happening there, what's happening to cultures in those two very important parts of the world. And I would like to invite Susan Crate to discuss the Vidyu-Saka horse and cattle breeders in subarctic Siberia. This is the people, this is the culture that is under threat. And then Wade will continue after her presentation, and then we will have a discussion. Ma'am.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Kaylee. Everyone at the Wilson Center for making this possible, and thank all of you for attending. I do want to make sure that I say that Saha, there are a lot of Saha in relation to other smaller cultures in the world, smaller numbered cultures in the world, and I would say that their culture is threatened because their environment is changing rather unprecedentedly, which is what I'm going to share with you today. So this is a picture of Siberia, and these are the two projects that I'm going to be talking about today. I want to acknowledge, of course, my funding source, National Science Foundation Office of Polar Programs. I'm going to be first giving you some orientation to the area of the world where my research is. Here's the huge country of Russia, the largest country in the world. Within it, 1/6 of the land area is the Sakha Republic. It's twice the area of Alaska. And the area where I work is along the Viliui River, a tributary of the Lena. The biome is taiga, or boreal forest, dotted with little round cryogenic lakes that are bordered by hayfields that transition to taiga. And it is an extreme environment with over 100 degrees Celsius annual temperature change from -60 Celsius to +40 in the summers. And Sakha are a Turkic people whose ancestors migrated from Central Asia around 900 to southern Siberia near Lake Baikal, and in the Genghis Khan period, they followed the Lena River north to their present area of inhabitants. I've worked with the communities in the Viliui regions where I am still working since 1991. I could tell you all about my work, but I don't have time today. But in short, I will tell you that towards the end of a project in 2005, communities started talking about changes that they had not experienced before or had not heard about before. And these were changes in patterns of weather, changes of seasonal timings, etc. So we spent the last few weeks of our summer interviewing elders to get a better sense of what these changes were, came back with the community's interest in conducting a full-fledged research project with them on these issues, and returned in 2008 with a 3-year project. The part of this that really, as an anthropologist, stood out for me was how so many of the elders talked about the bull of winter not arriving anymore. Well, what does that mean? For Sakha, like many place-based peoples, they have certain stories that explain annual seasonal changes. For Sakha, the bull of winter is that 3 months when it gets so cold and dry that it stops snowing. It's so cold that the bull has arrived. And as it gets less cold towards the end of February, one of the bull's horns falls off. A few weeks later, another horn falls off. Finally, the bull's head falls off and spring arrives. And when the elders, and I'd heard this story before, but the fact that the bull wasn't arriving made me really wonder what it would be like for the next generation when their parents told them this story about the way it used to be. It was no longer explaining an annual cycle, which really got me interested in understanding the cultural implications of these climate changes. And I would also argue with an attitude that I've run into that, oh, they will just adapt. For example, the Aveni, who are also a Siberian peoples who herd reindeer, will just start herding camels, as someone said. It's a lot more complex than that. You and I could adapt much more easily than people who not only depend on specific plants and animals, but have a worldview and a belief based in those plants and animals. So here I'm going to be talking to you about this project. We began the first summer with focus groups and interviews where we asked people to fill out a form first that told us what the changes are that they've been noticing, where they think those changes are coming from, how those changes are affecting their lives, and what they think the future will be like if those changes continue. And we followed up with interviews to ask similar questions to different members of the community, but also to delve more deeply in an interview exchange. And based upon those two methodologies, these are the 9 main changes that people talked about. And I'll illustrate each of those for you. Winters being warm, as you can imagine in this climate, made people happy to some extent. Less wood to heat their houses. The animals could go to the river to drink water out of the ice hole instead of humans having to haul the water to the barns. And their animals could be outside more. In that cold, they usually stay in the barn, so it was less work for humans, much less cleaning. But there obviously also were some downsides to winter being warm. More disease, especially for elders and children. And as we talked more with people, we started hearing proverbs about the cold. represented here for you to read. So again, the cold not only is a very important part of the physical ecosystem, but the cultural way of life. The land going underwater, as you can see, this is not a normal hayfield. It looks more like a lake, which is really what is happening in these areas in this part of the world. And it's hard to see, but these grasses here are reddish. It's a reed that's moving in, replacing the grasslands because of the aquatic environment that's being formed by the water on the land. This is a pen that Saha build around their haystacks to keep the horses who roam freely from eating all the hay before they get pulled in. Water on the land also interferes with accessing resources in the woods. It also interferes with accessing hay areas that are hayable because the edges are often flooded. And it's also resulting in some of these domino effects, we could say. As those circular lakes expand with water on the land, the trees bordering those lakes drown because their roots can't get any oxygen, and it starts these cascading effects. Water on the land also interferes with households. Many of these villages are based around lakes. And as you can see, this is the back fence of this yard. The lake in the center of this village is expanding as the water increases on the landscape. So it's interfering with households. It's making the foundations rot because of the dampness. And this is very hard to see, but there's a water line right about here. This is an underground freezer. Saha, one of their adaptations to this environment is to make a natural freezer. They dig a channel down to the permafrost and make a chamber there to freeze meat, to freeze ice for drinking water in the summer, etc. And these, as you can see, are now flooding. Raining a lot and at the wrong times. It's tending to rain not in the spring when they need the rain, but it is raining during the hay season. Any of you have cut hay, you know that it's not good for it to rain when you're trying to season the hay before you stack it, which is what is happening here. So very changed precipitation patterns. Summer's being cold. The summer, as you know, is very short, but it's very hot. And it's light most of the time, so it's a very intense growing period. But with the cold temperatures, gardens are not able to fully mature, the hay doesn't grow as well, and potato patches, all of these are supplemental parts of households' foods. And all the work that people have to do in this one part of the year is not very inspired when it's cold. And a saying, one day of summer is worth a week of winter, also clues you into the importance of that summer period for Saha. It also has, I would argue, a very strong cultural effect because people really look forward to that heat in the summer to recharge their spirits, to wear shorts and flip-flops, and to enjoy the natural environment. And so they feel a bit cheated. Increased flooding, of course, this is due to several factors. The bull not arriving and it snowing all winter long, the huge amount of snow that melts in the springtime. To give you some perspective, before we left in 2005, this lake was to the left of these telephone poles, and when we returned, it had already expanded over here. And this is a picture from 2008, our first summer, and they've had to continue to rebuild this road every summer for several times, bringing dirt from other areas. Roads are already not being used in villages. This gives you a good sense of this aquatic environment coming into these hayfields with the moss mats, and then infrastructure being broken by these floods. This is a bridge in a village. Timing of the seasons. Again, they've adapted to this very specific and extreme ecosystem. So the timing of the slaughter in the fall, usually done around mid to late November, they have to wait another 2 to 4 weeks because fall has become very elongated. It tends to freeze and thaw. It's very erratic. It's not this gradual cold to freezing as it used to be. This means feeding those animals for 2 to 4 more weeks, and it also means putting off restoring their meat stores in their households. Also, berries. These are the most important berry that they pick into the fall up until the freezing period. Brusniki, or crowberry. They're like a cranberry. They're very high in vitamins, and usually Saha just pour them into a big cardboard box and let them gradually freeze outside. But with the freeze and thaw, the skin of the berry is broken down, and they end up with a box full of mush. So again, these very nuanced adaptations that are being disrupted by these weather and climate patterns changing. Seasonal change also. For example, these are signs of spring for Saha. The Nurguhunar, which are like our crocuses that come up first in spring that tell us spring has come. The appearance of icicles is a sign of spring. And the larch, a deciduous conifer, whose little brushes come out every spring, a lot of these signs are showing up in this elongated fall. So how is this affecting people's orientation to their world? Lots of snow, I mentioned also. It's especially difficult for households. They usually have a break from shoveling snow when the bull of winter arrives and it doesn't snow, but now with continuous snow they have to be out and shovel all day, making their way to the various areas of their yards they need to get to and out to the street, and especially in the springtime before the thaw, so their house isn't inundated. But the biggest problem, I would say, with the snow is for the horses. Horses, like reindeer or caribou, live outside all year round, wander freely. In the winter with the snow, they dig, just like reindeer or caribou, through the snow down to the fodder. But with the freeze and thaw in the fall, often an ice cover forms right above the fodder. They cannot reach it, or there's just so much snow they can't even get down to the fodder in the first place. And many foals are dying because they're born into very deep snow. Very sudden temperature changes. These were reported across the board by people. Fewer birds and animals also. And again, this cues me to mention, too, we're not being myopic in our project by just saying it's all climate change. We are looking at all the other changes that are in here, what we call, I guess, in the academic world, multiple stressors. There's all kinds of issues going on. In the post-Soviet period, there are many more people who can afford guns and bullets. There's more hunters. The new generation of hunters has a very different hunting ethic. So we're taking into consideration all the factors. But we do know, for example, that hare, who are represented in this picture, do not like to nest in wet areas. And with the increased water on the land, it's very probable that they've changed their range due to this increased water on the land. So with more questions and follow-up conversations, asking about what people thought the causes of these changes were, most people pointed to this reservoir. In the 1950s, the Soviet government discovered diamonds and began to mine them. The first thing that they did was build a huge hydroelectric dam and plant on the Veluwe River to generate enough electricity to process the diamonds. This is actually a picture of the Mirny pipe that's now done. But many people talked about this huge reservoir as being a source of these changes. Many people talked about natural cycles. And of course, all of these explanatory stories hold some ground. Any group of people will adapt to colder, hotter, wetter, drier years. So one of the ways that Saha have adapted to wetter years is they drain their fields to get the water away, etc. But a dry period always follows. But anyway, this is one of the ways, especially older people were explaining these changes. Too much technica, which basically is saying too much technology. So you can probably see how many of these explanations also hold some ground when we're thinking about climate change. And again, you're looking at people in this picture who were born before there was a gas-fired engine in their village. So they've seen huge changes. Now there's cell phones in everybody's ear. So they've seen huge change, and it's understandable that they would point at these issues. Only a very small group of people we talked to mentioned global climate change. And these were either geography teachers or students who had just come in from the capital city to be home for the summer studying at the university, or elders who read every newspaper they could get their hand on. So people who were well read. So this told us there was not a lot of locally contextualized information about global climate change in these villages. In the second summer, we administered a survey which told us several things. One of them was that all the people we surveyed also had observed the 9 changes we had talked about, and that water was the most concerning one. Now, these are pictures I took before we started this project in 2008 on the way out to the villages, because I've flown this flight for 20 years, and I noticed looking out the window it looked like there was a lot more water down there. And then this is a quote from one of our people that summer about this water. We asked if people remembered there being this much water before, and the only memory people had was of a flood in 1959, which we found some archival pictures for, but of course the difference there was that the water was gone in a few days, and this water is not. And again, here are one of the ways that Saha have adapted or drained their hayfields when they need to in those years when there's too much water. So I'm just going to pause here for a second because I think it's important if we think about the fact that Saha and many other place-based peoples in the world have an understanding of their world that all of nature is sentient, which basically means that, for example, in this case, water has a spirit. How do we, as researchers, as people who are trying to facilitate adaptation, how do we bring information to people about what is part, if not all, of the cause of these changes? And Arlene Rosen, archaeologist who wrote this book on civilizing climate, argues, as I would agree, we need to really come into their perspective. How do they understand how rain and water comes into their lives in the first place? So part of it, and this is a depiction, a contemporary artist's depiction of the worldview of Saha, with the upper world of sky deities, the middle world of humans, the lower dark world, which is dark and you can't see anything there, and the shaman, who is the one who can move between these 3 worlds to interact with the spirits. So this is a very important part of our work and what we're still continuing to work on. We also know that people know the land very well. They go back to their homesteads, their ancestral places, to feed the spirits once or twice a year, to commune with their ancestors. So they notice when things like this happen. This is an ice wedge pushing up. And we also found an ethno-historical reference in their knowledge base about that in many ways refers to what's happening now. If you look at the maps of the Arctic ice cap, you'll notice that it's retreating just directly above this area of Russia where the Lena River comes in. And it also perhaps is explaining the increased humidity and the increased changes in weather patterns. So if you were living in this village, we asked ourselves, where would you be getting information about climate change? Well, there are some articles in the paper about several of the more northern villages that are completely inundated with water and residents have had to permanently relocate. And then this movie, I'm sure some of you have seen, The Day After Tomorrow, is shown rather regularly on the BBC broadcasting that they receive. So again, we ask ourselves, how would you make sense of what's going on? How would you understand this issue? So part of our efforts in this project, again, is to try to bring that detailed, in-depth, and very intimate understanding of how changes are occurring, part of which can be attributed to global climate change, into a forum, an exchange of knowledge with regional scientists who are specifically studying how global climate change is affecting the Republic. This is Alexander Fyodorov, who works at the Institute for Permafrost in Yakutsk. Before we left this summer to conduct these knowledge exchanges, we sat with Alexander. This is my colleague from the Institute of Humanitarian Research, Victoria Filipovna. We put together a presentation to bring to people in these different regional centers our research, what we have found by working with people in the villages, what Alexander Fyodorov has found out, etc. But before we began, and this is a shot from one of our presentations, I think this is in the Vilu Regional Center, we asked local people to talk about changes they've noticed. And we did that because we wanted them to understand how important their observations were, that in their own way they were an expert in change in their environment. And these are some of the testimonies that people shared. And of course, these people all pretty much live very close to the natural world. But we found gardeners, people who are out keeping horses out in the open, often referred to as cowboys, but they were actually watching horses. People like this are able to really give some fine detail as how these changes are bringing in new species and causing some disruption to these very fine adaptations they have. Here's a man who traveled, I think, 10 or 15 kilometers on his horse to come and be at our knowledge exchange and talk about how he has observed the land transforming. Alexander Fyodorov, I'm just going to show a few of the slides that he showed to help people understand how permafrost is and what the dilemma is for permafrost and climate change. This is a map of permafrost. All the colors represent a different kind of permafrost. You probably had no idea there were so many kinds of permafrost. And it turns out that this blue permafrost, which happens to be all throughout the Viluya regions where these people live, is the permafrost that's most susceptible to melting, to warming. It's got huge ice wedges in it, and you remember that big bump in the field, the ice wedge pushing up. So it's most susceptible to the landscape changing. That was an important point. These were also very valuable for people to see. This is what people are seeing in their backyards. They're seeing these sudden valleys being formed where there used to be a flat expanse. This was a flat field back here. It's falling in, okay? So this was extremely helpful for people to make that connection. Another very helpful image that he showed, the increase in annual temperature, air temperature, the increase in annual permafrost temperature. Showing this as an example of a house that has been built on a wedge of ice, and that wedge is responding to the warming permafrost. And again, this is a very common sight that people are seeing in their villages. Another common sight, as I mentioned before, with these lakes expanding and the trees dying and falling as those waters invade the forests, it's also having this cascading effect there too. He also showed a few of the techniques people have developed to try to protect the permafrost by building the houses up with pipes. The pipes, he did also mention that these pipes are in the wrong place. They should be under the soil that's then laid on top of the pipes and then the house, which keeps the cold air circulating underneath, keeping that permafrost cold in the winter, and closing the pipes in the summer to keep the warm air out. And a way that you can actually retrofit an old house, put a pipe down to the permafrost, put kerosene or diesel fuel in there to keep it very cold. So some of these techniques were also very helpful for people to see. We continue to work on this data, to work with our partners, and to begin this other project, which I'm just going to go through very quickly here. How much time do I have? I've 6 or 7. Okay. So in the meantime, about halfway through this one project I've been sharing with you, we started really looking at this seasonal change. How does this calendar shift affect people? And it turned out also that Arctic System Science of NSF had put out a call for changing seasonality. And they wanted social science and natural science projects coming together because they were interested in how is the phenology being affected, or most prominently in the springtime as the warming period is at a different time and the ecosystem, different parts of the ecosystem responds to that warmth, And then migrating animals come and find that for example, their food source has already hatched and flown away, right? Because they're missing each other. How do these missings in the ecosystem then ripple across to humans who have adapted to these systems and depend on these certain events to happen at certain times of year? And then when that response comes from humans, how does it feed back? It's a little complicated. But anyway, we're conducting this project in the villages where I am right now, and also in 4 villages in Labrador, Canada. Also, well, it's called Nunatsiavat. It just has achieved a native governance system. Nunatsiavat, Canada, in 4. Now, the big difference here is that, in contrast to Saha, who live inland and depend upon hayfields and are dependent on permafrost. Permafrost is an ecosystem service in their part of the world. These communities are dependent upon sea ice. So for them, the ecosystem service in question when it comes to climate change is sea ice. They hunt on it, the animals they need depend on it, etc. So I'm working with a historical climatologist, Astrid Ogilvie, who's at Boulder, who looks at how we can corroborate data. Not necessarily technical data, but data of journals, of tree rings, of all this data that we can bring together to recreate the climates of the past. So far we have I've started in my site. We're going up to Labrador in May, and then we'll be there in the summer to start the process. But I've started in my sites by just collecting images. For example, this image that really portrays, Saha's understanding of their forest and the resources there, obviously very much dependent upon the cycles we're talking about. This is by an eye, the spirit of the forest and of hunting. Also, you don't know the Saha language, but I can tell you this is a Russian calendar that's been brought into the Saha language, so there is that influence of the calendrical cycles of Russians coming in. But these are very specific times of year, very specific dates that are still recognized, and certain things are to happen on those days. We're paying attention to that. This is an example of one person's journals. It's amazing how many of the, especially older people in these villages, keep a journal every day. Maybe you know somebody who does that too. Farmers always used to do it in our country when there used to be real farmers. It was important. You needed to remember when the lake froze last year and when it thawed, and etc. And these are incredibly valuable for reconstructing past climates. So we've found many people who have kept those, and we're bringing that data into a database. And we're also getting people to keep new ones, especially about seasonal events. For example, when the flowers come up, when the first ducks come through in the spring or leave in the fall, etc. All these phenological markers. And we're interviewing people who, again, are gardeners and who know about the timing of these seasons. And I just wanted to mention, too, that, and Wade, of course, is going to tell you a lot more about other parts of the world in addition to the Amazon, because he's traveled much across the world, I'd probably say. But this is a depiction. I have edited a book with my colleague Mark Nuttall, and in this book, the section in the middle has really encounters by anthropologists who are working in a lot of the different, what we call climate-sensitive areas of the world. We hear a lot about the Arctic because the Arctic, it's very visual what's happening there. The ice is melting. It's an ecosystem dependent on water in a frozen, solid state. And it's also warming there more quickly than other parts of the world. We see more and hear more about it. We've also heard about the disappearing glaciers. So high altitude, high latitude, near sea level areas of the world, very dry areas of the world. In this book, we have anthropologists who are working in all these different parts of the world, specifically on how the people they're working with are experiencing these changes. And as I said in the beginning, it's not just a matter of adapting for most of them, because they have a very specific understanding of their world, and they're very rooted in their place. They have a long history there in many ways. And so lost cultures, a lot of this is about losing culture when you're staying in one place and when you're there. It's because the environment is literally changing underneath their feet. And this is a book that's out there. Please take a flyer if you'd like, and Machtana bin. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. And I wonder if we can just flip over to the next PowerPoint, if that's possible. Oops, do I have to need it over here? Okay, let's see.
Just close this.
There we go. Wonderful. Thanks so much, Susan. And I should apologize. The tardiness of my arrival is what delayed our proceedings today. I take total responsibility. It hasn't been the first time, I suspect. I think if there's one great lesson of anthropology, it's the idea that the world into which you were born is just a model of reality, and the other peoples aren't failed attempts at being you. They're unique answers sort of to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the myriad of cultures of the world respond to that question, they do so in 7,000 different voices. And anthropologists would argue that those voices collectively become our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us all as a species in the ensuing millennia. And one of the great revelations of science in our lifetime has in fact come from the geneticists, because they have done something that philosophers have always dreamed to do, and that is the fact that they have proved to us that human beings are all brothers and sisters. And I mean that not in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean quite literally, we are cut from the same genetic cloth. Studies of the human genome and the descent of the Y chromosome through the male lineage of humanity and mitochondrial DNA through the female lineage have left no doubt whatsoever that the human genome is a single continuum. Race has been exposed as an utter fiction. We are all cut from the same genetic cloth. Indeed, we are all descended from a relatively small number of individuals who walked out of Africa some 65,000 years ago. And then in this incredible hegira of 40,000 years, a mere 2,500 human generations, we carried the human spirit to every conceivable corner of the world. But if you accept that we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, it means by definition we all fundamentally share the same mental acuity, the same raw genius. And how that genius is expressed is simply a matter of adaptation and cultural choice. There is no ladder of progress in the affairs of culture, that old Victorian idea of a progression that invariably placed Victorian England at the apex of a pyramid that slipped down the sides to the so-called primitives of the world has been exposed as a complete cultural conceit, as irrelevant to our lives today as the 19th century idea of clergymen who believed that the earth was only 6,000 years old. The wonder of genetics has confirmed in a remarkable way the essential connectedness of humanity. And therefore, if we accept that these other peoples are not failed attempts of being us, but unique answers to that fundamental question, it behooves us to pay attention to how they choose to live on the earth. And we, of course, have this idea in the West that, they are perhaps, quaint and colorful, but somehow destined to fade away as if by natural law, as if indeed they are failed attempts at being modern. And nothing could be further from the truth. And I think this becomes particularly noticeable when we pay attention to different ways of thinking about landscape. We forget that the way we view the natural world is very culturally specific. In the attempt to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of the medieval church, as we moved into the Enlightenment, as Descartes suggested that all of life was simply mind and matter, in a single gesture he devitalized the planet. And in doing so, as Saul Bellow said, he anticipated a time when science would make a complete house cleaning of belief, and all issues of myth, metaphor, magic were dismissed as externalities. And the idea, for example, that the earth might have anima, that the flight of a hawk might have meaning, was ridiculed, dismissed as ridiculous. And in doing so, we ended up with this world that we simply see as a commodity to be exploited. I was raised in the forests of British Columbia, for example, to believe that those forests existed to be cut. That was the foundation of the ideology of scientific forestry that I learned in the forest and practiced as a logger and studied in school. That made me fundamentally different than my First Nations friends who of the Nuchalnith or the Kwakiuth, who believed that those same forests were the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven and the cannibal spirits that dwelt at the north end of the world, spirits that would have to be engaged during the Hamatsa initiation such that the youth could bring back to the community the wisdom of the wild to the potlatch. Now, the issue was not who was right and who was wrong. Was that forest mere cellulose and board feet, or was it the domain of the spirits? That's not the interesting question. The interesting question is the metaphorical foundation of the belief and what it does to change the ecological footprint of the particular culture and its interaction to that particular part of the world. The Kwakiuth and Nuchalnith lived on that coast for thousands of years, having a most modest ecological footprint. My lineage, by contrast, in but 3 generations, ripped those forests asunder. And so I want to sort of look at this idea of sacred geography, not again in the spirit of hippie ethnography, but what does it mean when people have different metaphorical ideas about the world, and how do those ideas affect their interaction with it? And just to sort of emphasize this idea that while we've been indulging in technological innovation, the great wizardry of the West, it's not as if the other peoples of the world have been intellectually idle. Let's slip for a moment into the greatest culture sphere ever brought into being by the human imagination, Polynesia. Tens of thousands of islands flung upon the southern seas. I recently sailed with the Polynesian Voyaging Society on the Hokulea, a recreated catamaran derived from the designs that Joseph Banks drew when he journeyed in the Pacific with Captain Cook in the 18th century. And even today, the sailors of the Polynesian Voyaging Society can name 250 stars in the night sky. They can sense the presence of distant atolls of islands beyond the visible horizon simply by watching carefully the reverberation of waves across the hull of their vessel, knowing full well that every island group in the Pacific has its own unique refractive pattern. These are sailors who in the hull of the vessel can distinguish as many as 5 different sea swells moving through the canoe at any one point in time, distinguishing those caused by local weather patterns from the deep currents that pulsate across the ocean and can be followed with the same ease with which a terrestrial explorer would follow a river to the sea. Indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of Polynesia, what you would have, of the ocean, what you would have is Polynesia. And the astonishing thing about the tradition was that it was all based on dead reckoning. Dead reckoning means that you only know where you are by remembering how you got there. There was no written word in the Polynesian culture. And what that implied was that over the course of a multi-week journey, the navigator, or the wayfinder, had to sit monk-like on the stern of the vessel, never sleeping, and remembering in his mind every shift of wind, every shift of current, every sign of the sea, the constellations, and the natural world around him. It was precisely the impossibility of dead reckoning on a long oceanic voyage that caused European transports to hug the shores of continents until the British solved the problem of longitude with the invention of the chronometer. But we know for a scientific fact that 10 centuries before Christ, the ancestors of the Polynesians set sail and spread that universal culture throughout the largest sphere ever brought into being by the human imagination. Now, if we go from the greatest ocean sphere into the greatest forest sphere, of course, we enter the homeland of the people of the Anaconda, the Barasana, a people who live so closely to the equatorial forest homeland that they do not cognitively distinguish the color blue from the color green because the canopy of the heavens is equated to the canopy of the forest. And if we go south into Ecuador, we enter a culture like the Guarani, a fascinating culture first peacefully contacted in 1958, fully 5 years after I was born. And at the time of contact, the missionaries made a critical mistake. In 1957, they had dropped from the air 8x10 glossy photographs of themselves in what we thought to be friendly gestures, forgetting that these people of the rainforest had never seen anything two-dimensional in their lives. And so they took them to be calling cards from the devil, and they promptly speared the missionaries to death. But it turned out the Guarani speared each other. 54% of their mortality was due to them spearing each other. We only traced genealogies back 8 generations and found only 2 cases of natural death. Now, this became our model for understanding life in the Amazon. isolated societies living amongst themselves, often in open conflict with their neighbors. The Waorani called everybody outside of their own culture kuwade, meaning cannibals. And these cultures became our lens on the Amazon precisely because by the time anthropologists and number entered the Amazon in the 1950s, the main basin of the Amazon had been depopulated by European disease for 400 years. These were the so-called marginal societies, not marginal because they were primitive, but because they literally lived on the margins of the basin. Isolated by geography from the east, by the Andean Cordillera from the west, the Waorani lived, as the crow flies, 120 kilometers from Quito, a city settled for 400 years, and yet they lived in isolation. Now, the Amazon invokes cliché as it defies hyperbole. And Joseph Conrad described it as less a rainforest than a primeval mob, a remnant in an ancient era when vegetation rioted and consumed the world. And this became our image of the Amazon as green hell that dominated the early part of the 20th century. By the time I came along as a student of conservation biology, the image had shifted to the idea that the Amazon was a delicate place, a counterfeit paradise that could only endure our ways for so long. And that image came about in part because it fed a very essential environmental agenda, but also, and more pertinent to this discussion, it fit what we understood about what it must have been like to be a human being living in this most difficult of ecosystems. But that was a complete projection from ourselves. And it denied the fact that if you simply looked into the journals of Aureliana and read what Caspar de Carvajal said in 1541, the Amazon wasn't an empty place. When he reached the confluence of the Rio Napo and the Ucayali in Peru, Aureliana himself went temporarily insane because he couldn't believe that on God's earth there could be a river that big. Little did he know what awaited him 2,500 miles downstream when the Amazon becomes an inland sea. But more incredibly, that riverbank was densely populated, not with thousands, but with millions of people. And so the question becomes, is there a place in the Amazon where the echoes and the adaptations of those ancient civilizations who lived in great concentrations in the Amazon can still be heard? And the incredible thing that has come out of anthropology recently is that there is. In a complex of cultures in the northwest Amazon of Colombia, the Blackwater River is a drain of forest the size of the country of France, the homeland of the Barasana, the Macuna, the Tanimucos. These societies are profoundly different. They do not value war as much as peace and wisdom, deep wisdom traditions based on shamanic initiations and great learning. They live in these massive malokas that in their architectural elaboration and symbolic resonance are equal to anything the Inca or the Maya ever built. They have strange customs that facilitate peace, not war, not the least of which is that you must marry someone who speaks a different language. And so in any one longhouse, you'll have 6 and 7 languages spoken, but you never hear a child practicing a distinct tongue. They simply wait, watch, listen, and one day begin to speak. And most extraordinarily, in their ritual elaborations and in their mythologies, they have a dynamic relationship with that forest such that their mythologies literally translate into a very precise land management plan that teaches one exactly how to live in the forest in great numbers. And what we've come to understand is that all the lens through which we looked at the Amazon for the last 40 years has been so distorted that it's comparable to having tried to understand British civilization from the perspective of the Hebrides after London had been nucleated by an atomic bomb. The people of the Anaconda reveal the way one can live in the Amazon. And paying attention to this interaction between landscape and character brings us into the realm of the Andes, a place where people literally believe that the earth is animate, alive, responsive to the human aspiration, even as human beings maintain reciprocal obligations to the earth. And again, this is not a notion derived from hippie ethnography. They live in the mountains. They see the way the mountains move with earthquakes, landslides. They see how a frost or a hailstorm in 10 minutes can wipe out the agricultural labor of a year. And they bring this idea of connection into ritual. Again, I was raised in Canada to believe that a mountain was a pile of rock ready to be mined. That made me profoundly different than my grandson, my godson in the community of Chinchero outside of Cusco, raised since childhood to believe the mountain that dominates his village is an Apu, a deity that will direct his destiny. And this belief system is affirmed in these stunning rituals, such as this one. Once each year, the fastest young boy is given the honor of becoming a woman. And in the traje of his sister or his mother, he is given the obligation to lead all able-bodied men on a run. But it's not your ordinary run. You start off at 11,500 feet, run 2,000 feet down to the base of the sacred mountain, and then run up to 16,000 feet, only to descend onto the sacred valley and cross two more soaring Andean ridges over the course of a very long 24-hour ritual cycle. The Wailakam is spin to bring the vortex of the feminine to the mountaintop. Coca is given to Pachamama, libations of alcohol to the wind. And the metaphor is so clear. You enter the mountain as an individual, but through sacrifice, which means, from Latin, to make sacred, you emerge as a single body who, through sacrifice, has reaffirmed your sense of being a community linked to landscape. And at 48, I became the only outsider and the oldest man ever to run this race, and I can assure you that I only managed to do so by chewing more coca leaves in one day than anyone in the 4,000-year history of the plant. But these localized rituals become pan-Andean in these fantastic festivals like the Coyariti, a kind of Andean Woodstock that occurs when the Pleiades reemerge in the sky just before the Catholic festival of Corpus Christi. Tens of thousands of people from all over the southern Andes in this beautiful expression of the pan-Andean syncretic world of Catholicism and pre-Columbian beliefs that becomes manifest on this pilgrimage, where in great costumes and regalia, with the symbols of the Christ movement up the Calvary, the steps of the cross. The crosses are carried in the shadow of the most sacred mountain of the Inca, Ausangati, planted in the ice on the glaciers, empowered in 24 hours, and then carried back to the community. Now this exemplifies what Susan was expressing. The ultimate act of this ritual always was men shipping blocks of ice to carry that ice back to the community, empowered such that those elders who could not participate in the ritual could nevertheless be part of the sacred cycle of the divine. Watching the recession of the Cocapunca glaciers has so frightened the people that they have unilaterally decided to stop that aspect of the ritual, which is very poignant because, of course, that trivial amount of ice chipped from the glacier is meaningless. And what we see here is another case of that climate change is not a technical problem for indigenous people. It's a psychological and spiritual problem. If you feel you're responsible for the earth and you see the earth going astray, you have the responsibility. And so here we have another poignant case of indigenous people who have no complicity whatsoever in this dilemma, personally taking responsibility for a solution in a manner that we have yet to do. And if we go from the southern Andes into the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, here is a place you hear the pre-Columbian voice unfettered and unaffected. Because these people are the descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization, which once carpeted the Caribbean coastal plain of Colombia. In the wake of the conquest, the four related tribes, the Wiwa, the Arawakos, the Cosis, and Conquanos, retreated in this isolated massif, where to this day they're ruled by a ritual priesthood of mamos. But the training for the priesthood is extraordinary. The young acolytes are taken away from their families at the age of 2 and 3 with the support of the families, held in a shadowy world of darkness for 18 years, 2 9-year periods deliberately chosen to mimic the 9 months of gestation you spend in your natural mother's womb. Now you're metaphorically in the womb of the Great Mother. And for that entire time, the world only exists as an abstraction as you are enculturated in the values of your society, which include the proposition that your prayers and your rituals alone maintain the cosmic or the ecological balance. And after this incredible initiation, the lad at the age of 18 who has never seen the world in all of its glory is taken on a pilgrimage to the heart of the world, to Saranqua, and suddenly everything they see is affirmed in stunning glory. The priest who has trained them says, you see, it's as I've told you all these years, it's yours to protect. Now talk about getting an environmental ethic into a culture. Now this man, I always wanted to go on one of these pilgrimages. No anthropologist had ever managed to do it. They're quite secretive about these rituals. This man walked into my office at the Geographic, and by complete chance, as he was talking to me, I said, you look like an old friend of mine. He turned out to be the son of, his name was Danilo Villafana, Arahuaco, and his father, Adalberto, on the right, was murdered by the paramilitaries in Colombia. And I was able to remind Adalberto that even though he didn't remember when he was a baby, I carried him on my back up and down the mountains for several months with his father. And based on that serendipitous encounter, and this man on the left, Eugenio, a cousin of Adalberto, is now this revered elder, second from the left. we were actually invited to go on this journey to the heart of the world. And we discovered that the initiates are not kept in the darkness for 18 years, but they are kept for 18 years in the environs of the sacred men's circle, much of the time in the darkness, acquiring the Baroque religious ideas of the culture, but then they do indeed go to the center of the world. Every ripple of the landscape resonates with mythological significance. Even the hats the Arhuacos weave from sisal are a conscious attempt to mimic the cap of ice on the body of Saranqua at the heart of the world. And as you get closer to the high ice, you make the payments to the earth, items from the sea brought to the ice, from the ice brought back to the sea. And actually, the night this photograph took, we had to escape the FARC who came to kidnap us. And you can't have a very dramatic escape on mules. You kind of clip-clop your way to rescue. But nevertheless, we return to the sea, where even though the sacred places are now covered by apartment complexes and whorehouses and discotheques, it doesn't stop the elder brother from making the ritual payments, from doing the prayers. And it's humbling to think that 2 hours from Miami Beach, this civilization is actively and in full paragraphs praying for our collective well-being. They call themselves the elder brothers, and they dismiss the rest of us who have ruined the world as the younger brothers, and they earnestly ask us to change our ways. Now, what are those ways? This is where I live in Canada. My closest friend, Taltan, this actually photograph, of all these photographs, I didn't take. This one turned out, this Sarah Lean took this for the National Geographic. This is a photograph that was seen around the world. Oscar got all these phone calls from Poland and Russia, and he'd say, wait, there's this girl from Poland coming to see me. And I'd say, Oz, I don't even think, you don't speak Polish, what are you going to do? And she'd say, I don't think she's coming for conversation. He had this endless series of women coming through, because he's a very charismatic and fearless guy. But the point is that his homeland is being destroyed by industrial initiatives. And in a place that they know as the sacred headwaters, where 3 of the most important salmon rivers of home are born in the same meadows, Royal Dutch Shell has a proposal to extract coal-bed methane gas from a network of 6,000 wellheads. Environmental concerns aside, let's just think for a moment what it takes in our culture to secure that kind of privilege to the earth. In Canada, all you have to do is cobble together a company in Toronto with less history than my dog, get online and secure the subsurface rights to a place you've never been, the stories of which you've never heard, the pain of a long winter you've never experienced, neither the promise of a bright spring. And as long as you can guarantee the government a revenue flow, either in the form of royalties or taxation, you, by definition, for your own private interests, secure the right to transform that landscape forever. What's fascinating, there's not a single metric in the calculus that rationalizes the industrialization of the wild that places any value whatsoever on the land that is about to be destroyed, or conversely, places any cost to the commons, the rest of us, for its destruction. We take that as a given because it's a cultural bound way that we rationalize the industrialization of an inanimate world. But that's highly anomalous in the affairs of human beings around the world. And, you know, it's a little bit like if you're selling roses from your garden in Bethesda, and I walk in and say, listen, I want to buy all your roses. So we have a transaction. I buy all your roses, you sell all your roses, and as I'm walking away, I say, by the way, I'm destroying your house. And you say, wait a minute, how are you going to compensate me for that? No, this is a transaction about roses. It's not about your house. But that's what a coal company does. It goes in, takes the coal, leaves in its wake a house of a people destroyed. And when I say this is not normal around the world, let's go to the opposite extreme, the Aboriginal civilizations of that most parsimonious of continents. And I've always been interested in Aboriginal society because we know from studies of the Y chromosome that these were the first humans to walk out of Africa. In very short order, they crossed the underbelly of Asia, they crossed the water that still separated Australia from New Guinea, and then they went walking. And over the course of hundreds of generations, they established 10,000 clan territories, like a matrix, upon the entire continent. The clan territories had various sizes, depending on the carrying capacity of the landscape, but the clans themselves were fiercely rooted to place. Linking the territories was a single idea, the dream time, which was not a dream as we would think of it, but a multidimensional state of perpetual reality. The song line was simply the trajectory the rainbow serpent created at the dawn of time, the trajectory along which the ancestral beings walked when they sang the world into existence. Now, when the British got to Australia, they met a people that looked strange, that had primitive technology. But what deeply offended the British is that the Aboriginal people had no interest in improving upon their lot. For the British, that was anathema, because self-improvement, progress was the ethos of 19th century and 18th century Britain. So trying to figure this out, the British in their inimitable way concluded that the Australian Aborigines were simply not people, and they began to shoot them. And as recently as 1902, it was debated in Parliament in Australia as to whether Aboriginal people were human beings or not. As recently as the 1960s, a school book in Australia, A Treasury of Fauna of Australia, included the Aborigines as amongst the interesting forms of wildlife on the continent. But what was actually going on was a subtle devotional philosophy far beyond the British to understand, and that was the dream time. In not one of the 670 dialects or languages of Australia was there a word for time. There was not a word for past, present, or future. There was only the dreaming. And the dreaming was a multidimensional state of eternal existence in which the entire purpose of life was not to improve upon anything. To the contrary, the entire ethos of this civilization was stasis, constancy. The only purpose of humanity was to do the ritual gestures that were deemed to be necessary to keep the earth exactly as it was at the time of the first dawning. It's as if all of human intellectual thought in the West had been devoted to pruning the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keep that place exactly as it was when Adam and Eve had their fateful conversation. Now, the fascinating thing, again, is not to say who's right and who's wrong, but to ask yourself a question, an existential question, and think in terms of the long term. Had the human spirit followed this devotional track, yes, we would not have put a man on the moon. But on the other hand, we wouldn't be here talking about climate change and the capacity of our part of humanity, with a shallow history in the industrial world of scarcely 300 years, to literally to be in a situation where we are changing the life support systems of the planet itself. And of course, as Susan mentioned, the places where you see this most powerfully are in the extremes, the mountain heights of the world, and of course in the Arctic. And when the British first went to the Arctic, again, they misunderstood the people. They took them to be savages. The Inuit of Canada thought the British were gods. Both were wrong. One did more to honor the human race. And what the British failed to understand was that there was no better measure of genius than the ability to survive in a harsh environment where everything had to be forged from the coal. The runners of the Comatex were not made from wood. There was no wood. They were made from fish. 3 Arctic char laid in a row, wrapped in a caribou hide, and greased with the stomach content of the caribou. When the British mimicked the ways of the Inuit, they achieved great feats of exploration. But of course, most of the time, they persisted in importing their own environment with them, rather than adapting to a new one. And so when the last of Lord Franklin's men were found frozen to death at Starvation Cove at the Adelaide Peninsula, the naval sailors were in the traces of a sled built of oak and iron in Manchester, England, that weighed 500 pounds. On top of it was a dory from Franklin's ship that weighed 300 pounds. Inside the dory were all the accoutrements of a British naval officer's dinner service, including silver plate and a copy of the novel The Vicar of Wakefield. This they somehow expected to drag through the endless boreal forests of Canada, hoping that they might bump into a Hudson Bay post and achieve salvation. Well, of course, they suffered a terrible death. But the Inuit moved lightly on the land. This is a photograph I took 250 miles out on the sea ice from Igloolik when I was polar bear hunting with a community of Inuk men. And that night, the temperature dropped to minus 65 Celsius, and that was before the wind came up. We simply made an igloo, or they made an igloo, I watched, and we had dinner, meat, cut on the ice, a place where blood on ice is not a sign of death, as Greenpeace would suggest, but rather an affirmation of life itself. The Inuit didn't fear the cold, they took advantage of it. When I was narwhal hunting at the tip of Baffin Island with this group from Arctic Bay, I recorded this remarkable story from Olayak, the man on your left. During the 1950s, a dark period of Canadian history, we forced the Inuit into settlements, thinking that in order to establish our sovereignty in an archipelago that could have gone back to the Europeans. This man's grandfather categorically refused to move, and so the family, fearful for his life, took away all of his weapons and all of his tools, thinking that that would oblige him to go along and go into the settlements. But it didn't. In the middle of an Arctic night with a blizzard blowing, the old man slipped outside of the igloo, pulled down his sealskin and caribou hide trousers, and defecated into his hand. As the feces began to freeze, he shaped it in the form of an implement. And as the implement made from human waste and forged by the cold took final shape, he put a spray of saliva along the leading edge, and with what the Inuit call a shit knife, he killed a dog. He skinned a dog, improvised traces of a sled from the skin of the dead dog, a sled from the rib cage of the dead dog, and then harnessed up an adjacent living dog, and shit knife and belt disappeared into the Arctic night. Now talk about getting by with nothing. And an extraordinary symbol of the resilience of Inuit people, a resilience that, of course, has been sorely tested today by something far beyond their capacity to adapt to, and that is, as Susan said, climate change. This is a photograph taken in the northernmost community in the world, in Qaanaaq, in northwest Greenland, an incredibly inspired community that have every single modern technical device necessary for modern life, but they had the wisdom to recognize that their dogs were in fact a cultural pivot. And so they made a rule that no skidoos would be allowed in their community because they knew that the act of raising dogs, the freedom from the cash economy the dogs implied, and the freedom to move widely on the ice, all your fuel that you needed was meat, was something about how they could stay alive. And this is a great example how anthropologists are not talking about the traditional versus the modern, freezing people in time, reducing societies to zoological specimen. There are no lost cultures. There are only changing cultures. All cultures are always dancing with new possibilities for life. It's not about the traditional versus the modern. It's about the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives, even as we ask the profound question, what kind of world do we want to live in? And unfortunately, the world of the polar Eskimo is melting. And the ice in Qaanaaq used to come in September and stay until July. Now it comes in November and is gone by March. So their entire world, in a sense, has been turned upside down. And so, in the end, we really have to ask ourselves, not think of these cultures as being lost. There are 7,000 languages still spoken today. Every one reflects a body of knowledge that deserves to have a place at the Council of Human Wisdom. What we have to begin to ask is to challenge the notion we have of the exceptional nature of modernity and the exceptional nature of our particular culture. Not because there's anything wrong with us, but because the curse of humanity since the dawn of consciousness has been cultural myopia, whether it's a Waorani thinking that every outsider is a cannibal, or whether it's us believing that our way is the only way, and that we, a culture, a country, in which 2/3 of the world's antipsychotic drugs are consumed, a country that put 400 million tons of toxic waste into our environment every year, a country that reveres marriages but allows half our marriages to end in divorce, a country that says we love our elders but only has 6% of our homes with grandparents and grandchildren beneath the same home, that we say we love our kids but we celebrate a slogan 24/7 implying the total dedication to the workplace, and we wonder why the average American youth by the age of 18 has spent 5 years watching television or playing video games. We're many wonderful things, but the paragon of humanity's potential, we are not. These other peoples aren't failed attempts at being us. They're unique answers to that fundamental question. Together, we can move forward to a truly multicultural, pluralistic world. Thank you.
Dynamite as always. We just heard two extraordinary presentations about the intertwined fate of the diversity of cultures and peoples in this world, and what is happening to the environment of each and every one of them in different ways in different places. And I don't know whether, Susan, you want to say something in response to Wade or vice versa, or we just throw it up and for questions?
Well, I'll say wow. Oh. That was amazing.
Well, one thing that's interesting from Susan, what's fascinating is that how you go to these talks and your eyes are open to a world you hadn't thought about. I hadn't really thought of permafrost and those kinds of implications, and I certainly hadn't seen imagery that graphically revealed what was happening to these subboreal communities. And I mentioned, for example, the response of the people of the southern Andes to what they see in their glaciers. But I did not mention that the Arhuacos and the Kogi, who literally believe that they are in a sense the Tibetans of the Americas, the most Baroque. And some people think, incidentally, that that's not necessarily a pre-Columbian tradition, but rather that's something that came in the wake of the terrible Holocaust of the conquest, where the descendants who survived basically said, we really screwed up, we're not going to ever screw up again. And some anthropologists think that's maybe the key to the intensity of their beliefs, but the beliefs are intense, and so they are watching those ice fields, because of course they are much closer to the equator, so they're just visually going up, and they are in a total ritual panic, and this is something that I think is worth thinking about. It's one thing for the Ganges to become a seasonal river, a river that 500 million people depend on for water, but it's also a river sacred to 800 million people. And so the geopolitical consequences of this on the level of culture are severe. There was an incident in High Kashmir at one of the highest Hindu shrines in the world where every winter, for some serendipitous reason, a great ice phallus would form in a cave. It was one of the greatest sort of ritual pilgrimage sites of the Hindu faith. And thousands would walk up to this huge isolated cave system above a glacier, and a year or two ago the Washington Post reported that they got there and it was gone. Didn't exist, and there was a massive riot. So I think climate change has huge psychological and spiritual consequences, and we tend to, because of our mechanistic worldview, think of it as strictly a technical issue of mitigation or adaptation.
Right.
Good. So questions, comments? This is usually not a bashful audience.
I see one.
Please.
Okay.
Just going to ask, so what is the answer? Oh, okay. I was just going to ask, do you have an answer? Because clearly it would also be, if we were to actually say, well, nothing can change, that's clearly a change, because that would be a change, for our society, for many other societies kind of on the edge of our societies that are looking at it saying, hey, this looks like, because there are many that I've seen that look at this society and say, this looks like a more comfortable way to be. I'd like to join, and feel that they're getting locked out. And so if we were to stop the climate change for the reasons, that you talk about, we would then create the problem of, first off, how are we going to live? And second off, what about the people if we were to stop it by just saying, oh, well, no further progress?
Well, you see, there's so many assumptions in what you said. And first of all, these cultures aren't drifting out of existence. They're being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. These are not fragile people. These are dynamic people that are not lining up to become us, but they're being forced into economic circumstances that leave them essentially as a kind of a global proletariat. It's not, these cultures aren't destined to fade away. They're being driven out of existence, and that's an optimistic observation because you can identify the causes of cultural loss and allows us to be the facilitators of cultural survival. Egregious industrialization, ideology, the very cult of modernity that perpetrates this idea that our way of life is the way of life, B, it's achievable for everybody, when E.O. Wilson alone suggests that on energy consumption alone you need 4 planet Earths to bring the world's up to our level of population, and it assumes that that people who aspire by their own volition to enter this kind of realm that we call our culture, that they're going to be able to do that, whereas most places around the world they end up turning their backs on their traditions and securing only a place in the lowest rung of an economic ladder that goes nowhere, and end up in a kind of sea of misery around these demographic centers that are the cities of the third world.
And it's not like they are static in any case.
They're not static. I mean, and we're not, and no one's talking about freezing people or having no change. On the contrary, the question is how can all of us live in a truly multicultural world in which every single human being has access to the genius of modernity, whether that's science or medicine, without that engagement having to demand the death of their ethnicity. Because when that happens, chaos happens.
And I would like to just add that I think something that Wade also mentioned, I think in the context of the issues in British Columbia, just think of how relatively short period of time humans have been industrious, been in the industrial mode.
300 years.
Compared to our entire history. And we cannot tell ourselves that before that period we weren't happy, our lives were not full. I mean, there were issues, there's always going to be issues. I think the danger is, and I've seen way too many people with these graphs of telling us about our future electricity demands, where there's absolutely nothing in this equation that has to do with humans actually changing, changing the kind of energy they use. It's not that we have to go without or not be able to do all the things we want to do. We have to transform our own way of doing those things. And we have everything we need. There are, if you look at it, and also alluded to by Wade, there are huge corporations that are, and I probably shouldn't talk about this, but anyway I'm going to, huge corporations that are very much invested in us maintaining being a fossil fuel culture. And we have to look that right in the face. And I think that's what's keeping us from making the leap. Look at China. China is way ahead of us in alternative energy. They're developing the technology. So there's a lot of issues, I think, that are, below the surface that aren't that hard to see. It's what to do about it, I guess, which is really the question.
There's another thing. There's not a single indice in the modern development paradigm that says anything about quality of life. Life expectancy goes up by 20 years. It just may mean that infant mortality drops. Per capita income quadruples. It may mean that someone comes from an agrarian culture into a sweatshop. Even rates of literacy only are helpful if the individual can maintain their sense of who they are. I mean, typically, literacy comes in a certain kind of ideological context. So that, for example, if you think of the pastoral nomads of northern Kenya, where I've spent a lot of time, there's a very keen desire to have a child educated, to have one foot in the cash economy as one way of mitigating the impact of drought. Nothing wrong with that. But the problem is children who tend to be elderly boys are sent off to these parochial schools, either missionary schools or schools run by the state, a state for whom pastoral nomads don't really fit its notion of modernity. So they go into school as a nomad, learn a modicum of literacy, but also in an environment that teaches them to have contempt for who their parents are. So they go to school as a nomad, they graduate as a clerk, they can't go back because they're ashamed to be who they were, and yet going forward means going forward into an economy with a 70% unemployment rate for high school graduates. So what do? They drift to the slums of Nairobi and they try to scratch a living from the edges of a cash economy, and we call that progress because the literacy rate of Kenya just went up by one person. And I see that all around the world.
So, back there on the aisle.
Thank you very much. I'm French, but I've been working with UNESCO for intangible cultural heritage. So we've been documenting during 6 years in high definition. And what we missed are the scholars. At the end, perfect images in high definition, because Japan was financing it in high definition. My question is, we will have this coming May a conference in Europe. One of the objectives is to document intangible cultures, whatever we call them, peripheral cultures, primitive cultures. You may know what we did in Paris. My question is there today a body of knowledge which can be organized in order to be used in schools, local communities around the world, a sort of curriculum, basic literacy about cultures? In Scandinavia, probably you heard of forest fin culture. And those who know the least are those in Sweden and Norway, because they fight for it. So, sorry to take it that part, but could you advise me the sources of a body of knowledge I can organize so that I can use it in visual form, most of it, if possible, in schools and local communities in Europe, Japan, where I can start now?
Well, when I was first brought to the National Geographic 10 years ago, the whole idea of this Explorer in Residence program was really a part of their launch of a major conservation initiative for their second century. And I was sort of the social anthropologist brought on to sort of deal with issues of language loss. And I mean, one of the incredible statistics that is out there and has not only never been refuted, there's an absolute consensus in the academic linguistic community that fully half of the languages of the world aren't being taught to children. Well, that means by definition we're living through a period where in a generation or two half of humanity's intellectual, social, and spiritual knowledge has been lost. I mean, that should be something that would provoke a clarion call. And the challenge we had at the Geographic is, well, what do you do about it? I mean, you can't make a rainforest park of the mind, you can't freeze people in time. And so we really set out to try to, with the idea that storytellers can change the world, and that the best thing we could really try to do is change the way people viewed and valued culture. And it wasn't really that soft an idea. I mean, if you think about it, in 30 years, women have gone from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar. You know, I mean, this wonderful man invented the term biodiversity within my lifetime as a student. Now that word is part of the vernacular of school children. So change comes about in remarkably fast ways. And so one of the things we did is we took our global audience of 250 million people through our television channel, and we did a series of films that were a series called Light at the Edge of the World, 8-hour films where we took the audience to places in the realm of culture where the beliefs were so dazzling that you couldn't help but come away with a new appreciation of the wonder of culture. I think one of the challenges that academic anthropology has, like all the academic disciplines, is that basic kind of storytelling, which can be so politically effective, is not necessarily valued within the academy. And so you have, you know, situations such as 9/11, when the American Anthropological Association met in Washington, D.C., in the immediate wake of the biggest story of culture the country or any of them would ever embrace. The entire gathering earned only a single line in the Washington Post in the style section that basically said the nutcases are in town again. And you didn't know who was more kind of remiss, the government and the media, for not listening to the one profession that really could answer the question, why do they hate us? Or the discipline, or the academic discipline itself, for being very clever and organizing all these. There were some fantastic symposia that addressed that question because anthropologists wanted to know too. And yet we didn't have the capacity to step outside of the academic world to really communicate the vital lessons. And I think that anthropology as a discipline has a huge potential to contribute to this overall narrative.
That's a very interesting point. It seems to me that a really wonderful contribution to this combined challenge to the survival of the cultural and environmental wonders of our world is actually reigniting a sense of wonder about it all. So
that's true in biology as well as in anthropology.
Yes.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'd be curious, you guys have such a great opportunity to have visited so many remote cultures, without getting into kind of modernity versus traditional, but just the uniqueness. And I appreciated kind of the thought that each culture is kind of a response, and not right or wrong, but different. And in the context of change, given environment and climate, sort of what way forward to this gentleman's question of, I'd be curious if you see any similarity of sort of the Mayan prophecy, or kind of whether it's end times, not being necessarily apocalyptic, but transformative, kind of Vedic cycles, thinking that you've heard from different societies you visited of kind of something larger, macro scale change kind of layering on top of the animate sort of respect for environment that you've seen, is there any thread that unites?
I thought it was very interesting what Susan put up, that slide that showed the responses, messing with the sky, the space program. And, our first inclination is always to sort of not necessarily make fun of that, but sort of dismiss it. And yet that's how else would we expect people to respond?
Very right on. Yeah. But I would respond also. Of course, people somehow out there they get the 2012 Mayan. The question came up in our knowledge exchanges about. Actually, they posed the question to Dr. Fyodorov about what's going to happen in 2012, and he said there really was no proof that was going to happen. But that's sort of a different layer of, he might have been the wrong person to ask about that. I would say that, if you think, okay, the world's going to end, what just does that mean? I mean, it could be that, yes, in fact, if we look at the trajectory of environmental change, the loss of biodiversity, the loss of cultural diversity, the loss of languages, we see that things are changing unprecedentedly, okay, as far as we know. So maybe we're not talking about the physical ball of the world ending and us not being here, but that the world as we know it is going to end. Now, whether we, come into that new way of being on the world and are able to survive and perpetuate is one of the questions I think we need to entertain. If we continue the way we're going, it doesn't look so good as far as we can tell, unless something unexpected is up there that's going to change everything. But we know that there are some pretty clear signals from our ecosystem, from our people that we know that live around the world that don't live like us, that things are changing pretty drastically. So there is change, and I think the real question is, when this way of being on the world ends, where are we going to be? Where are we going to transition to?
I think it's fascinating, the climate debate, because why would anyone be concerned about a phantasmagorical fantasy like Maya calendar 2012 when our scientists are telling us every day that climate change represents a scenario of such severe consequences? And Tom and I were both in Copenhagen, and Tom's been a leading figure on this, but what struck me is that I find it fascinating that the very people who deny the scientific consensus, in effect, they are the champions of modernity, and yet they're denying the very tool that birthed modernity. I mean, how can you have it both ways? How can you say that the scientific consensus is absolutely nonsense? Well, then, given the intensity and consistency of the consensus, you're really saying, I don't believe in science. Well, then how can you then turn around and maintain this kind of sense of triumphalism of the West? I find that curious. And when you look at climate change, there's only four possibilities. The scientists are either all wrong, in which case we do nothing and the world sort of just continues this trend. The scientists are all wrong, but we mitigate anyway, and what do? We make a cleaner, better, more technologically integrated world. The scientists are right, and we mitigate. It suggests that for maybe 3 to 4% of global GDP, we can solve a problem, and guess what? Make a cleaner, technologically more integrated world. And remember that in World War II, the United States of America spent 38% of GDP to defeat the Germans and the Japanese. So 4% isn't that enormous a figure in historical terms. And of course, as Carter Roberts told me in Copenhagen, and Tom as well, if the scientists are right and we do nothing, the consequences range from the dreadful to the truly catastrophic, from the realm of science fiction. So the only thing that seems strange is inaction.
And I just want to add really quickly, too, that it's not just a transition to different fuels. It's not just a transition to other technology, right? It's a transition to a lot of what Wade was presenting and what I think I was presenting, too. It's bringing ourselves back to the place where we feel connected, not just with our natural world, but with each other, that we start interacting more with each other, we start teaching our children those kinds of ways of being instead of just plopping them in front of the TV, where we actually understand that we have stories in our lives. We're storytellers too. I mean, there's incredible storytellers, especially in North Carolina where I used to live. So, and it's something we can all do. We can regenerate that whole way of being.
The other thing, when I wrote this book called The Wayfinders, the editor put a subtitle, Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in the Modern World, which actually forced me to answer the question before the end of the book. And I sort of answered it implicitly through this book. But in the end, I really said, it matters. Why does ancient wisdom matter? 2 words, climate change. Not because the Kogi or the Warani or any of these societies are going to inform us what to do about this dilemma, but rather from the fact that the very existence of other ways of being, other ways of thinking, puts a lie to those who say we cannot change the way we all know we must change, the fundamental way we live on the planet. We're not on a train wreck to history. We're not on these, rail tracks that go inexorably to the future and we can't get off. On the contrary, all these other different visions of life brought into being by the other cultures of the world suggest there are any number of options and other ways of living on the planet. So it's quite optimistic.
So there are multiple definitions of the quality of life. So we got time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions, but I know Wade and Susan will be around afterwards for those, all the way in the back there. Yes.
Hi, I want to thank Wade for adjusting the title of the talk, because in signing up and registering, I thought the lost cultures would be a discussion about those cultures around the world that suffered genocide that are no longer with us on planet Earth. So the discussion today really was enlightening about all those wonderful cultures that still are with us that can teach us. So thank you, Wade, for that correction, because it's very important. But going back to my original assumption about the talk, it really struck me that if you look at all those cultures that were genocided, that we've lost, and all the knowledge, it speaks to a question around, what can really shift human society, because several people have posited what would it take for Western civilization to actually change. And I guess I wanted to ask the speakers, does it have to be catastrophic? Does it have to be something so full of calamity that those in Western civilization have no choice but to change? Because it appears to me from following, from the Copenhagen talks back years, that they're just not willing to make the change because there's nothing forcing them to feel that they have to. And I guess a parallel to that, do you feel in working with indigenous cultures around the world that there's anything else they can do in communicating to Western civilization the results beyond what we see in the photos, in the movies, in the videos, on the channel about what's happening? Because to me, there's a missing between the calamity that has to happen to make them change and the communication that we're receiving.
I don't think change needs to be catalyzed by calamity. I mean, change is sort of always ongoing, and it's all part of a kind of stream of history. I mean, again, 35 years ago, getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was a great environmental victory. No one spoke about climate change. I mean, I don't think change has to be driven by catastrophe. And when we're talking about the loss of cultures and the loss of cultures in the past, again, the biological analogy is apropos. Yes, extinction is a natural thing in nature, but in general, over the last 600 million years, speciation has outpaced extinction. And by the same token, languages have come and gone in the past. We don't speak Latin in the streets of Rome, but before it disappeared or slipped away, it left the 12 Romance languages. Now the pace of species loss, like the pace of language loss, it's a scale of the pace that is so disturbing. But so cultures always are coming and going, but I don't think at all you need calamity to provoke change. I think change is organically happening around us all the time. And that's why I look to things like look at the social changes in this country in the last 40 years. It's profoundly hopeful.
So, Paul.
A couple of months ago, I was told by a good friend of mine, John Liu, that I should pay a lot of attention to this guy, Pavan Sukhdev, and this new thing called TEEB, which is T-E-E-B, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. Well, they've been sponsored and run by UNEP, and they've just come out with their first of several volumes on analyzing this problem. But what they talk about, I've only gotten to the introduction, I'm not going to the full rundown, but they talk about the critical problem that we don't put a price and we don't put a value on ecosystems and biodiversity, and we need to think in our systems that, you know, the forests in British Columbia, you know, currently has a value. It's called lumber, you know, and that's the only one that the pressures from our society and what we're talking about is going after that. And so I'm greatly encouraged that this discussion is coming at that level, and hopefully something will come of that. But it's
well, let me respond to that specifically, because Pavan is one of my closest friends and colleagues, and he is just a sheer delight. And I'm looking for an opportunity to give him a good sort of platform here in Washington. And I think it's the best work ever done about bringing some of the value of nature into how economic decisions are made. And it's not actually putting a price on nature, although you can think of it that way. Some people find that sort of an offensive idea, but it is about bringing those values in. And that's just a great example of how human creativity can work in the right direction on the kinds of things we've been talking about today. So one last question, and oh, this is hard. Okay, down here.
I'm not an anthropologist, but I do keep an eye on these things because I'm very, very interested in it.
Microphone.
Oops, sorry. One thing I discovered about 3 weeks ago is I don't know if it's a new site or if it's an old site that I just found, but it's an open source site called the Open Anthropology Community or Consortium. I discovered a paper on there that I find so lucid and so well documented and so provocative that I'm sending it around to just about everybody I think it can make a difference to. It's by anthropologist at Birkbeck College in the in UK. Name is Sean Sullivan. It's called Banking Nature, and it talks about how nature is being given a cash value. And it talks about it from a large sense of how the markets and the global markets are doing that. It's just one of the best things I've ever read. And it basically works on the premise that it's turning the cultural lens not on indigenous communities in particular, but turning the cultural lens on ourselves and saying, okay, how do you define value? Is it only price? You know, is biodiversity measured, and I've seen it because I've gone through the measurement factors. Is it measured by numbers of trees, or is it measured by numbers of species? In almost any metric system that's coming up today that's going to be used by the financial community, it's measured by numbers of trees. You will not find the word species in that measurement system.
So you're quite right. I mean, sort of improving the way economic decisions are made is only one set of values. And we've just had a whole afternoon of different aspects of values. On the economic tree side, I should say that our next one is all going to be about forests. Right? It's April 20, led by Bill Summers from George Mason, but also having Sandra Brown from Winrock and the head of climate change for, I think, the Forest Service. anyway, thinking about all of this and the role of living things and carbon and the desirability of having some kind of carbon payments for nature, actually maintaining carbon in nature as opposed to in the atmosphere. That again is only a narrow little sliver, and I like to say that valuing a forest for its carbon is like valuing a computer chip only for its silicon. So multiple values is what it's all about. And let Wade and Susan have the final word here.
Well, I was just, if we're on the topic of trees, I don't know this story by heart, but it reminded me of somebody was looking for let's design something that will hold the water in the soil, that will provide habitat for animals. You know, they kind of had this checklist of characteristics of this technological thing they needed to design, and of course it turned out to be a tree. So, you know, the bottom line is that, you know, I always think of that Parquet commercial when I was a child, you know, the margarine commercial, you know, Mother Nature would come out and say, it's not nice to fool Mother Nature, you know, and it's sort of the whole science of biomimicry. We're looking at spider webs, threads, to figure out how to make really strong thread. So here we are looking back to nature. It's been there all the time, and I'm just saying we'll
have a whole program on that at some point.
Oh, it's just, you know, there's so much there that we are coming back to and realizing it. It's like the prodigal children.
So April 20, same time, same place, the focus on forests, and please join me in thanking two great speakers.